Dr. Alexa Martinez never imagined that her childhood nightmare would become her life's work. When she was 7 years old, her neighbor smiled at her every morning before school, waved from his garden, and gave her candy on Halloween. 3 months later, police found 17 bodies buried in his backyard. That memory haunted Alexa through medical school, through her psychology doctorate, and into her career as a forensic psychologist. Now, at 32, she sat in her cluttered university office, surrounded by case files that represented 2 decades of research. 1,000 individuals, 1,000 people who had committed unspeakable acts, 1,000 minds she had studied, interviewed, and analyzed to answer a single burning question: what makes someone evil? The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Alexa opened the first file. Marcus Thompson, age 19 when he killed his entire family on Christmas morning. She remembered their first interview vividly. He had been polite, articulate, even charming. Nothing about his demeanor suggested the monster that newspapers described. That disconnect between appearance and reality had driven her deeper into her research, pushing her to look beyond surface-level explanations for human cruelty. Her methodology was unconventional. While other researchers focused on brain scans and genetic markers, Alexa spent countless hours talking to these individuals. She wanted to understand their thoughts, their justifications, their emotional landscapes. She conducted interviews in maximum security prisons, psychiatric facilities, and courtrooms. Each conversation added another piece to a puzzle that seemed to grow more complex with every revelation. The breakthrough came during her interview with Sarah Chun, a woman who had poisoned 3 husbands over 15 years. Sarah spoke about her crimes with the same casual tone most people use to discuss their grocery shopping. But it wasn't psychopathy that chilled Alexa to the bone. It was the moment Sarah described feeling genuinely loved by her victims. She had cared for them, in her twisted way, even as she slowly killed them. That interview forced Alexa to confront an uncomfortable truth. Evil wasn't always born from hatred, trauma, or mental illness. Sometimes it emerged from love itself, twisted beyond recognition. She began categorizing her subjects not by their crimes, but by their emotional drivers. The pattern that emerged was both fascinating and terrifying. Alexa's research revealed that evil rarely announced itself with obvious warning signs. The neighbors who seemed too helpful, the partners who were overwhelmingly romantic, the friends who always knew exactly what to say. These individuals had mastered the art of appearing normal, even admirable, while harboring dark intentions. She documented how they learned to mimic appropriate emotional responses, studying others like actors preparing for roles. They understood that genuine connection required vulnerability, so they became experts at manufacturing false intimacy. They knew that trust required consistency, so they built carefully crafted personas that people wanted to believe in. The most disturbing discovery was how many of her subjects genuinely believed they were good people. They had constructed elaborate justifications for their actions, viewing themselves as misunderstood heroes or necessary evils. This self-deception wasn't a conscious choice, but a psychological defense. mechanism that allowed them to maintain their sense of identity while committing horrific acts. As Alexa compiled her findings, she realized that understanding evil required accepting an uncomfortable reality about human nature itself. The capacity for cruelty existed within everyone, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. The difference between good people and evil people wasn't the presence or absence of dark impulses, but what they chose to do when those impulses surfaced. Her research began attracting attention from law enforcement agencies, mental health professionals, and academic institutions. They wanted to understand her methodology, to learn how she had gained access to insights that had eluded other researchers. But Alexa knew that her discoveries came with a price. Each interview had left its mark on her psyche, forcing her to confront the darkest aspects of humanity. Late one evening, as she prepared to leave her office, Alexa noticed something that made her blood run cold. The security footage from the building's entrance showed a familiar face entering the psychology department. It was David Brennan, one of her most disturbing subjects, a man who had been released from prison just 3 weeks earlier. He had specifically requested to see her, claiming he had new information about his case that would revolutionize her research. Alexa's hands trembled as she watched the timestamp. David had entered the building 20 minutes ago, but she hadn't received any notification of his arrival. The elevator security camera showed him pressing the button for her floor. As she reached for her phone to call security, the lights in her office suddenly went out, leaving her in complete darkness with only the glow of her computer screen illuminating the 1,000 case files that surrounded her. The emergency lighting flickered on, casting eerie shadows across Alexa's office walls. Her heart pounded as she fumbled for her phone, but before she could dial security, a gentle knock echoed through the darkness. David Brennan's voice carried through the door, calm and measured, exactly as she remembered from their interviews 2 years ago. "Dr. Martinez, I apologize for the dramatic entrance. The power outage wasn't my doing, I assure you." His tone held the same unsettling politeness that had made their previous conversations so uncomfortable. "I have something important to share with you about your research." Alexa pressed herself against the far wall, her mind racing through escape routes. David had been convicted of manipulating elderly residents at a nursing home where he worked, convincing them to change their wills before they died under suspicious circumstances. What made his case particularly disturbing wasn't the murders themselves, but the genuine affection his victims had felt for him until their final moments. "I'm not here to hurt you, doctor." Quite the opposite, actually. David's voice moved closer to the door. "Your research changed my perspective on myself. I've spent every day since my release thinking about our conversations, analyzing my own motivations through the framework you developed." Against her better judgment, Alexa found herself listening. During their interviews, David had been one of the few subjects who seemed genuinely interested in understanding his own psychology. He had asked thoughtful questions about her methodology and demonstrated remarkable self-awareness about his manipulative tendencies. "I know you're frightened," David continued, "but I need you to understand something crucial about your work. You've been studying the wrong variable." Alexa's scientific curiosity warred with her survival instincts. Her research had indeed identified patterns in criminal behavior, but she had always suspected that she was missing a critical component. The power outage seemed too coincidental, but David's words struck at the heart of her deepest professional insecurities. "What do you mean?" she called out, surprising herself by engaging with him. "You've been focusing on what makes people commit evil acts," David replied. "But the real question is what makes people choose to stop." The statement hit Alexa like a physical blow. In all her research, she had never systematically studied individuals who had dark impulses but chose not to act on them. She had been so focused on understanding completed evil that she had ignored the psychology of restraint. "I spent 15 years working at that nursing home before I killed anyone," David's voice continued. 15 years of having the same impulses, the same opportunities, the same justifications. Something changed in year 16. That's what you need to understand. Alexa realized that David was right. Her research had a fundamental flaw. She had studied evil after it had already manifested, but she had never examined the psychological mechanisms that prevented evil from occurring. The distinction between having dark thoughts and acting on them represented a crucial gap in her understanding. "You interviewed Margaret Foster last month," David said, and Alexa felt her blood turn to ice. Margaret was one of her most recent subjects, a woman who had killed her 3 children and attempted suicide. "She told you about the voice that stopped her the first time, didn't she?" Alexa's hands shook as she remembered Margaret's testimony. The woman had described hearing a voice that prevented her from harming her children during a severe postpartum depression episode. It had taken her 3 more years before she finally committed the murders. Alexa had dismissed the voice as a hallucination, but now she wondered if it represented something more significant. "The voice wasn't a hallucination, Doctor. It was her conscience fighting back. Every person you've studied had those moments of resistance before they crossed the line. You've been documenting the wrong turning points." The revelation struck Alexa with devastating clarity. She had been approaching evil as a destination rather than a journey. She had focused on the moment people became monsters, instead of the longer process of moral degradation that preceded their actions. The real story wasn't about transformation, but about the gradual erosion of internal barriers. "I want to help you understand this," David said. "But first, you need to make a choice. You can call security right now, and I'll leave peacefully. Your research will continue as it has, missing this crucial element. Or you can let me show you something that will revolutionize everything you think you know about the psychology of evil." Alexa stared at the door, knowing that her next decision would define not only her research but potentially her life. David represented everything she had been studying, but he was also offering insights that could validate years of work while pointing toward breakthrough discoveries. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was facing her own moral choice, her own moment of potential crossing a line. The emergency lighting continued to flicker, creating a strobing effect that made the shadows dance across her case files. 1,000 evil people stared back at her from photograph corners and police reports. She thought about all the victims those people had created, all the families destroyed, all the lives lost. Then she thought about all the future victims who might be saved if she could truly understand how to recognize evil before it acted. Her finger hovered over the security number on her phone as David waited patiently outside her door. Alexa's finger remained frozen over the security number as David's words echoed in her mind. Against every instinct screaming at her to run, she found herself setting the phone down. Her scientific curiosity had always been her greatest strength and her most dangerous weakness. "You have 5 minutes," she called through the door, her voice steadier than she felt. "Then I'm calling security regardless of what you tell me." The door handle turned slowly, and David stepped into the emergency lighting's pale glow. He looked exactly as she remembered. Average height, unremarkable features, the kind of face that disappeared in crowds. That ordinariness had been part of what made him so effective at gaining his victims' trust. "Thank you for trusting me, even partially," David said, closing the door behind him but leaving it unlocked. "I want to show you something that will change how you understand evil forever." He reached into his jacket, and Alexa tensed, but he only withdrew a thick manila folder. "These are psychological profiles I've been working on since my release. Not of other criminals, but of people who stopped themselves from becoming criminals." Alexa's eyes widened as she examined the contents. The folder contained detailed case studies of individuals who had experienced violent impulses, planned harmful acts, or found themselves on the verge of committing serious crimes but had pulled back at the last moment. Each profile included interviews, psychological assessments, and timeline analyses of their decision-making processes. "How did you get access to these people?" Alexa asked, forgetting her fear as she absorbed the implications of what she was seeing. "I found them the same way you found your subjects," David replied. "Through support groups, online forums, therapy sessions. But instead of studying people who crossed the line, I studied people who approached it and turned away." The profiles revealed patterns that Alexa had never considered. These individuals described specific moments when they felt themselves capable of terrible acts but chose differently. Many described it as hearing their own voice arguing against their impulses, creating internal dialogue that gradually strengthened their moral resistance. "This is what I discovered during my 15 years of restraint," David continued. "Evil isn't a switch that flips on. It's a muscle that gets stronger with exercise. Every time I chose not to act on my impulses, I was actually weakening my ability to resist them later." Alexa looked up from the files, confused. "That doesn't make sense. Choosing good should strengthen your moral resistance, not weaken it." David's expression grew somber. "That's where you're wrong, Doctor. Each time I resisted, I also reinforced the pathways that created those impulses in the first place. I was acknowledging that the thoughts had power over me. I was validating their existence by fighting them." The concept challenged everything Alexa thought she understood about moral psychology. Traditional models suggested that resisting temptation strengthened willpower, but David was describing a more complex dynamic, where the very act of resistance could become a form of engagement with evil impulses. The people in these files discovered something different, David explained. They didn't fight their dark thoughts. They redirected them. Alexa flipped through more profiles, finding case studies of individuals who had channeled violent impulses into competitive sports, creative outlets, or helping professions. They hadn't suppressed their capacity for aggression, but had found socially acceptable ways to express it. One man here wanted to hurt children, David said, pointing to a specific file. Instead of fighting that urge, he became a pediatric surgeon. He found a way to cut into children's bodies while saving their lives. The impulse remained, but the expression transformed completely. The psychological elegance of this approach fascinated Alexa. Instead of viewing dark impulses as something to be eliminated, these individuals had treated them as energy to be redirected. They had accepted their shadow selves while refusing to let those shadows control their actions. "Why are you showing me this?" Alexa asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Because you need to understand what happened to me in year 16, David replied. "I stopped trying to redirect my impulses. I started fighting them instead. And the more I fought, the stronger they became." David described how his resistance had gradually transformed into a form of obsession. He found himself thinking about his violent fantasies more frequently, analyzing them in greater detail, and ultimately planning scenarios he initially had no intention of executing. The psychological energy he had previously channeled into caring for elderly residents became focused entirely on internal warfare between his conscious mind and his dark desires. "The moment I decided I was strong enough to simply resist without redirection, I began my journey toward becoming the person you studied," David admitted. "The families I destroyed, the elderly people who trusted me, the lives I ended, all of that began with my choice to fight evil instead of transforming it." Alexa felt her worldview shifting as she processed David's confession. Her research had documented the end results of moral failure, but she had never examined the psychological processes that preceded those failures. She had been studying evil's manifestation without understanding its gestation period. "These profiles represent the people you never interviewed," David continued. "The ones who had the same capacity for evil as your subjects, but chose a different path. They're the control group your research has been missing." The implication staggered Alexa. If David was correct, then her entire approach to understanding and preventing evil was fundamentally flawed. She had been treating moral behavior as a simple binary choice between good and evil, when the reality was far more nuanced and psychologically complex. David stood up, preparing to leave. "I have 93 more profiles at home. People who are living proof that evil can be transformed rather than simply resisted. The question is whether you're brave enough to expand your research beyond their comfortable boundaries of studying completed monsters." As he reached for the door handle, Alexa made a decision that would haunt her for weeks to come. "Wait," Alexa called out as David's hand touched the door handle. The word escaped her lips before she could stop it, sealing her fate in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. David turned back, a knowing expression crossing his features. "You want to see the other profiles?" It wasn't a question. Alexa nodded, knowing she was making a choice that violated every safety protocol she had ever learned. But the scientist in her couldn't let this opportunity slip away. These profiles represented the missing piece of her life's work, the control group that could validate or destroy everything she had concluded about the psychology of evil. "My apartment is 15 minutes from here," David said. "I'll understand if you want to bring security or meet in a public place." Alexa considered her options. Meeting David at his residence was clearly dangerous, but she also knew that involving others would compromise the authenticity of whatever he wanted to show her. Her research had always required her to venture into uncomfortable territory, to sit across from killers and sociopaths without backup or protection. "I'll follow you in my car," she decided, "and I'll be tracking my location." David nodded approvingly. Smart precaution. "I'd expect nothing less from someone who spent her career studying people like me." The drive to David's apartment gave Alexa time to process what she had learned. Her hands gripped the steering wheel as she considered the possibility that her entire research methodology was flawed. If evil was truly about the failure to redirect rather than the presence of dark impulses, then she had been studying the wrong population entirely. David's apartment surprised her with its normalcy. Books lined the walls, plants thrived in carefully tended pots, and classical music played softly from hidden speakers. It looked like the home of any educated professional, not someone who had committed multiple murders. "I know what you're thinking," David said as he led her to his study. "How can someone who kills innocent people maintain such a peaceful living space?" The study contained what looked like a makeshift research laboratory. Computers displayed psychological assessment software, filing cabinets held hundreds of case studies, and whiteboards covered in diagrams mapped out complex behavioral patterns. David had essentially recreated Alexa's research setup in his personal space. "This is what I've been doing since my release," David explained. "Continuing your work, but from the other direction." Alexa examined the profiles more carefully. Each file documented individuals who had experienced homicidal ideation, rape fantasies, or impulses toward child abuse, but had never acted on these thoughts. What made their stories remarkable wasn't the absence of evil impulses, but the presence of specific psychological strategies that had allowed them to transform those impulses into positive actions. "This woman here," David pointed to a file labeled Jennifer Walsh, fantasized about strangling her coworkers during stressful meetings. Instead of fighting the urge, she became a massage therapist. She found a way to use her hands on people's necks in a healing context. Another profile described a man who had experienced detailed revenge fantasies against people who had wronged him. Rather than suppressing these thoughts, he had become a mystery novelist, channeling his imagination for violence into fictional scenarios that entertain readers without harming real people. "The common element," David continued, "is that none of these people tried to eliminate their dark impulses. They accepted them as part of their psychological makeup and found creative ways to express them constructively." As Alexa reviewed more cases, she began to see the pattern David described. Traditional approaches to managing violent thoughts focused on suppression and resistance. But these individuals had discovered that acceptance and redirection were more effective long-term strategies. "Why didn't you use this approach yourself?" Alexa asked. David's expression darkened. "Because I believed I was different. I thought my impulses were too strong, too specific to be redirected. I convinced myself that pure willpower was the only option." He pulled out a journal filled with his own handwriting. "This documents my psychological state during those final months before I killed my first victim. You can see how my resistance strategies gradually transformed into planning strategies." The journal entries were chilling in their progression. David had started by writing about his impulses as a way to release psychological pressure. But over time, the writing had become more detailed, more focused, and ultimately more like a blueprint for action than a method of catharsis. "The moment I stopped looking for redirection and started relying solely on resistance, I began the process of becoming the killer you studied," David admitted. "Every day, I told myself I was strong enough to just say no became a day when the voice saying yes grew louder." Alexa felt a chill as she recognized the psychological dynamic David described. It mirrored addiction patterns, where attempts at complete abstinence often led to more severe relapses than harm reduction approaches. These profiles prove that evil isn't inevitable, even for people with the strongest violent impulses, David said. But they also prove that traditional approaches to managing those impulses are fundamentally flawed. As Alexa absorbed the implications of David's research, she realized that he had essentially completed the other half of her life's work. Together, their findings could revolutionize understanding of criminal psychology and potentially prevent countless future crimes. But sitting in a convicted killer's apartment, surrounded by case studies that challenged her core beliefs, Alexa also understood that she was crossing professional and personal boundaries that could never be uncrossed. David had drawn her into his world just as effectively as he had manipulated his elderly victims. "There's one more thing you need to see," David said, moving toward a locked filing cabinet. The profile that started it all. As he reached for the key, Alexa noticed something that made her stomach drop. On David's desk, partially hidden beneath other papers, was a psychological profile with her own name written at the two. Alexa's eyes fixed on her own name written across the top of the psychological profile. Her breathing became shallow as David noticed her discovery. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker, as if the walls were closing in around her. "You saw it," David said quietly, his tone shifting from collaborative to something she couldn't quite identify. "I was wondering when you'd notice. Why do you have a profile on me?" Alexa's voice barely rose above a whisper, but her mind was racing through everything she knew about David's methodology. He studied people extensively before taking action. David moved to the filing cabinet, withdrawing a thick folder that he placed on the desk between them. "Because, Dr. Martinez, you're the most dangerous person I've ever encountered." The statement hung in the air like a physical presence. Alexa had expected many things from this encounter, but being called dangerous by a convicted serial killer wasn't among them. You've spent 15 years studying evil without developing any meaningful safeguards against it. David continued, opening her profile. You've absorbed the thinking patterns, the justification methods, and the emotional frameworks of 1,000 criminals. You've essentially given yourself a graduate education in how to commit perfect crimes. Alexa stared at the profile, seeing her own psychological patterns analyzed with the same clinical detachment she had applied to her subjects. David had documented her increasing cynicism, her growing isolation from normal social relationships, and her gradual development of what he termed moral numbness toward human suffering. Every researcher who studies evil faces the same risk, David explained. The abyss gazes also. But most researchers study evil from a distance, through reports and statistics. You chose to sit across from monsters and let them tell you their stories directly. The profile contained transcripts of Alexa's own words from their previous interviews, analyzed for psychological indicators. David had identified moments when she had expressed understanding for her subjects' motivations, times when she had seemed to appreciate the intelligence behind their methods, instances where she had defended their actions as psychologically logical. You're not evil, Dr. Martinez, but you're standing at the same crossroads where all your subjects once stood. The difference is that your education and intelligence make you far more dangerous than any of them ever were. Alexa read her own profile with growing horror. David had documented how her research had gradually eroded her emotional responses to violence. She had started her career feeling sick after interviews with violent criminals. Now, she conducted those same interviews while eating lunch. The progression was subtle but undeniable. The question isn't whether you have the capacity for evil, David said. The question is whether you'll recognize it before you act on it. David opened the locked filing cabinet and withdrew one final folder. This is the profile I mentioned, the one that started my research into redirection versus resistance. He handed her a file with his own name on it, but dated from 20 years earlier. Inside, Alexa found a psychological assessment that David had written about himself during his early years at the nursing home. The young man described in these pages bore little resemblance to the killer she had interviewed. I was studying myself the same way you're studying criminals now, David explained. I documented my impulses, analyzed my thought patterns, and tried to understand my own psychology objectively. I thought knowledge would protect me from becoming the monster I was afraid I might be. The early entries showed a compassionate care worker who was troubled by occasional violent thoughts, but was actively seeking to understand and manage them. David had been conducting a form of self-therapy, trying to prevent himself from harming the elderly residents he genuinely cared about. The problem was that studying evil, even in yourself, requires you to spend time thinking about evil, David continued. The more I analyzed my dark impulses, the more detailed and frequent they became. I was feeding the very thoughts I was trying to eliminate. Alexa saw the parallel immediately. Her own research had required her to immerse herself in the minds of killers, rapists, and abusers. She had spent thousands of hours thinking about violence, analyzing cruelty, and understanding manipulation tactics. The accumulated psychological weight of that exposure had never occurred to her as a risk factor. The people in my positive profiles found ways to redirect their energy without dwelling on their dark impulses, David said. They acknowledged the thoughts briefly and immediately channeled that energy elsewhere. They didn't study evil. They studied good. David closed the filing cabinet and turned to face Alexa directly. Your research is groundbreaking, Dr. Martinez, but it's also transforming you into exactly the kind of person you've spent your career studying. You're becoming dangerous not despite your knowledge, but because of it. Alexa felt something shift inside her mind, a recognition that was both liberating and terrifying. David was right. She had spent so much time understanding evil that she had lost touch with good. Her relationships had suffered, her empathy had diminished, and her moral compass had become clouded by academic objectivity. What happens now? She asked. David smiled, and for the first time, it seemed genuinely warm rather than manipulative. Now you choose. You can continue your research as it is, knowing the risks. Or you can transform it into something that studies light instead of darkness. You can become the researcher who understands how to build psychological immunity to evil rather than just documenting its symptoms. Alexa looked around David's apartment one final time, understanding that this moment would define the rest of her career and possibly her life. She had come here seeking to understand evil and had instead discovered something far more valuable, the possibility of genuine redemption, both for her subjects and for herself. 6 months later, Dr. Alexa Martinez published the most revolutionary paper in criminal psychology history. Her research center now focuses not on studying completed evil, but on understanding psychological resilience. She helps individuals with violent impulses find constructive outlets, and she trains other researchers to study darkness without being consumed by it. David Brennan became her first research partner in this new approach, proving that even those who have crossed the line into evil can find their way back to light. If you found this story as compelling as I did creating it, please subscribe for more psychological thrillers that explore the hidden depths of human nature. Share this with someone who loves mystery and psychology, and let me know in the comments what other dark corners of the human mind you'd like me to investigate. Your engagement helps me continue uncovering the stories that matter most.